welcome to ShelfTalkers. But I'm not breaking any rules. We have a plexiglass thing, so we can actually have faces this time. It's very exciting. My name is Suzanne. I'm the adult programming librarian here at Downtown. And this is Mick. She is the lead of Reader's Advisory here at Downtown. So today we are finishing up our novel and translation month with nonfiction books that have been translated, actually. I'm very excited to see your selections, Mick.
Somewhat curious about yours as well. Shall I go first, or do you want to?
You can go first.
Well, I seem to be surrounded by Norwegians. Come to find out, when I started going through the list of and we do have several, quite a few, books on nonfiction that have been translated from other languages into English, much to our gain. I found out that 3 of the 4 were all written previously in various Norwegian languages, all translated by different translators.
Which is interesting.
I know. And finally, an Italian book. So let's start with the Norwegians. The first one, and this is a relatively new book to the system, was published this year. It's The Book of Eels, subtitled Our Enduring Fascination with the Most Mysterious Creature in the Natural World by Patrick Svensson. He's a journalist. This is his first book. And it's translated from the Norwegian by Agnes Broome. Most people's first reaction to eels is, and I quote one of the reviewers, yuck, on many levels. Squirmy, even the eating part, which is a delicacy, I believe, in England.
I think, yeah.
Kind of yuck is a big one. So little is known about eels. The scientists actually refer to it as the eel question. We, to this day, still don't know how we've never seen them procreate. We've never seen them give birth, and they're not sure what drives them. Most live and die in the sea, but there are some, and I think, if I'm not mispronouncing it, it's called the anguilla. They loved it so much they repeated the name twice. And it starts in the sea, goes to the, regular water, and then gets this compulsion at the end of their lives to go back to die in the sea again. None of this do they know why. He focuses mainly, it's less an analysis of eels. There's a little bit of scientific information, enough to satisfy, I think. But it's more a meditation on their glories of eels and the historical studies of people that explored eels. And what I was surprised, there's actually a connection between eels and psychoanalysis.
Really?
Yes, it seems that Sigmund Freud decided to take 400 eels and cut them up to try to determine that he was going to find out how they procreated. And he never did, but he was stuck with 400.
I did not know
eels.
We knew so little about eels.
I know, it's fascinating. I highly recommend this book, by the way. Next, still in the natural history, but don't we love natural history? Buzz, Sting, Bite, Why We Need Insects by Anne Sverdrup-Thygeson, I think. Translated from the Norwegian by Lucy Moffatt. This, obviously, is about insects. They have been around for about 479 million years. And they number, at this point, about 200 million per human being living today. And I swear they were all in my backyard this weekend. The author, to answer the question of why we have so many, she described them as because they're small, supple, and sexy. They can live anywhere, but we're seeing a great decline recently in the numbers of insects. And this is troublesome because they're involved in almost every aspect of Earth existence. They are involved in soil formation, seed dispersal, almost any aspect of life. So to put it bluntly, they could live fine without us, and probably much better. We cannot live without them. Very interesting book, very well written. Again, the last Norwegian, and I find this one interesting. It's called So Much Longing in So Little Space, The Art of Edward Munch. And this is by the writer, fiction writer, Karl of Knausgaard. I don't know, are you familiar with his work? It's translated from the Norwegian by Ingvild Burkey. He's the one that wrote that and is still writing, I think, 6-volume autobiographical novel called The Struggle.
Oh, I think I have heard of
I think we only have 1 and 4 in the system at the moment. But what I liked, I read one review about it when I was trying to decide personally whether I wanted to read about it. And he said the title should be Most Famous Norwegian Writer Since Knud Hamsun Considers the Most Famous Norwegian Painter Ever. And if you remember Munch, he's the one that did The Scream. He's very famous for that one. It's not that much about Munch's life. It's more, I'm trying to think of a good word for it, a cultural excavation. It's more what it means to be an artist in general. And the writer shares his thoughts on that from his own perspective. But also what it's like to be a very highly talented artist, and from a very restrictive Scandinavian background that came up in a period of radical change. So I find it's more about that. When he describes art, it's not like an art critic. He kind of goes, well, to the right, there's this little thingy here, and to the left, there's this, which is what a writer would do. So to get more of a artist's take on his works, he just would get in a plane and fly somewhere to talk to somebody who knew a bit about Munch. So he spends a lot of time doing that kind of thing. I think it's also very interesting. And last but not least, to represent the Italians, I love this book. It's The Periodic Table by Primo Levi, translated from the Italian by Raymond Rosenthal. Levi was a chemist, a poet, a writer, and this is more a collection of short stories, very autobiographical in essence. And each, I think there's 21 chapters, each is titled by an element in the periodic table. And that element is not just a hint, it's a core to the entire episode. And he talks about his life, which involved being in the resistance, being anti-fascist, being betrayed, arrested, and he ended up in Auschwitz. In fact, the one short story that I read, essentially chemistry saved his life. It's mainly about chemistry and how it reveals about life. So it's more about life than it is about science, I think, unless you want to use life to talk about science.
I like autobiographies that look at their life using a theme, to focus on. I like stories like that.
And in Auschwitz, he used his knowledge of chemistry to actually survive, turning elements around him into things that he could eat, despite the difficulty in doing so. So again, another fascinating one.
That does sound really interesting. So mine, I have a bit of a smorgasbord here.
Speaking of the Norwegian,
thanks to Mick. So let's see, I'll start with my Scandinavian. This is Things My Son Needs to Know About the World by Frederick Bachman, translated by Alice Mezies. It was written in Swedish originally and is now in English. And it is a look at 21st century parenting by a New York Times bestselling author. Frederick Bachman wrote A Man Called Ove. Did I pronounce that correctly?
I always said Ove, but then I'm more minimalistic than
this has been a very hard month for us. So it's a musings and apologies to his children for embarrassing them and to his wife for ruining things. Like one that made me laugh was, yes, I knew we were starting to feed the baby food, but if you leave 10 small Tupperware containers of mashed potatoes in the refrigerator, I'm going to eat them. I apologize. I didn't know they were for the baby. I just really love mashed potatoes. And as that's about the stage where we're at, starting to talk about how we're going to be making baby food and everything, I can totally see that happening at our house. We'll be like, oh, hey, look, mashed potatoes. This is for us, right? So I thought that was pretty funny. So it's a pretty enjoyable read. So I have a couple of cookbooks. The first one is A Taste of Ancient Rome by Ilaria Gozzini-Giacosa, translated by Annie Herkelotz. So Ms. Giacosa heard some tourists in Pompeii at a pizza restaurant going, yes, the ancient Roman food of pizza, how delightful. I'm so glad to enjoy this. And it got her thinking, and her husband had this conversation. A lot of the foods that you think of as Mediterranean, tomatoes, pizza, risotto, all that kind of stuff, relies on foods that were imported from the New World. And so in ancient Rome, they didn't have any of those. So they were curious, what did they eat? What was traditional Italian Roman cooking? So she went through and she found some very, very ancient sources of recipes and everything. And she tried to pull the ones that you could still get the parts for, which means there are a few recipes in here that call for lamb brains.
Yeah, you can.
Because you can still get those. I know. I don't know where to get those at my grocery store. They're not on the meat counter shelf.
It's a special order.
Yeah. So, but they're interesting. It's an interesting look at ancient Roman recipes. My husband and I have actually tried an ancient Roman recipe. It was garlic cheese with some herbs.
That's what you shared with.
Yeah, I shared some with you.
Yes, we liked it very much.
It was incredibly spicy because it was pure garlic. Instead of a mortar and pestle, though, we just had a food processor. So maybe it would have been better if it had been ground up a little finer.
It was very good. The cats loved it too.
Our house smelled like garlic for days. The other cookbook I have is Grandma's German Cookbook by Brigitte Hamm and Lynn Schmidt, translated by Barbara Hopkinson. Obviously, it started its life in German. And what's great about this cookbook is they have these grandmothers and they give you little stories about them as they're giving you their recipes for food. Because I always feel like my grandmother made the best of whatever it was. So they have grandmas from all over Germany that have made their best recipes for them. And they've got beautiful pictures to go with all of the recipes and little notes like, this is how we do it and stuff like that.
So it's translated in an American market. You could...
Yes.
To do it that way. Good.
Yes, and so it's really cute, and it's very good, and the recipes all sounded really delicious. There were a few in there that I was like, I'm going to have to get this book out so I can take it home and make it. So I'm pretty excited about that one. And then my last one is probably the most interesting one. It is a medieval home companion, Housekeeping in the 14th Century, translated and edited by Tanya Bayard. So, what it is in 14th century France, an elderly Frenchman married a 15-year-old girl. And he knew he was going to outlive her, and she would have another husband. So, he wrote instructions on everything from how to behave at a dinner party to how to get stains out of your clothing, how to keep house, and all of these things. And at first I was kind of like, that's a little iffy, an old man leaving his young wife instructions on how to care for his house properly. But when I read the introduction, the context of it was actually something incredibly kind that he was offering. So he must have been very smart, very clever. He was learned. He wrote an entire book on how to manage his house. So he was a smart man, but he wasn't a powerful man. He wasn't a very highly ranked noble. She came from a more powerful ranking, but her family must not have had a lot of money if they married her off to him. So he knew he was going to die and she would need to remarry. So to enable her to be better on the marriage market, he left her this guide that she can follow to become a wife that people would want to have. And so it was a gift that he gave her, and a lot of it is basic stuff that maybe she already knew, but maybe not. He says that she had asked him to teach her so that she could be a good wife and run his household, and he kind of went off the wall and wrote an entire book. But it is one of the best sources of life in the 1300s that we have. This shows how they lived, what was important to them, what their house life would kind of look
The
like.
social customs too, I think, would be interesting.
Yes, and so it's an incredible resource. And for a long time, apparently, there was one translation that everybody used, and it was not a very good translation. The man that translated it from the original French, translated it and put in his own thoughts and wars and changed out words because he thought that that's not really what they meant. And so it was an inaccurate translation. So this is a new translation, and it's supplemented with illustrations with woodcuts, so that it's got some beautiful illustrations to go with it. So it's a very interesting book. From a glimpse at a time that you don't know much about, because history is written about big things, and so it's a lot harder to get the small things of, how do you clean your clothes? That's an important part of something they did every day.
Yeah.
But that doesn't get written very often until some old Frenchman was like, I'm going to tell my young wife how to wash clothes.
Okay.
And so here it is. This is our best resource as to what life would have looked like in the 14th century.
And we talked a bit about how some things have been upgraded in their translation, when we know more about what's going on and that kind of thing. So.
Yes, and sometimes the translations suffer from an excess of zeal in... Honestly, it's almost like a colonization type thing, where you'll have somebody from a society that thinks they're better than the society they're translating from.
And that gets communicated.
And that gets communicated in their translation. And so that's a little bit what happened here. So,
well, sadly, this is our last installment.
This is our last installment of the translation.
That's what I meant, about the translation.
Yeah. So we've had a lot of fun with the difficult names.
And we talked about next week.
We did. We're going to discuss whether or not you can judge a book by its cover.
Yes, the pros and cons.
Yes, it'll be exciting. So remember, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, goodbye.